They say land remembers who walks on it. The pine needles don't crunch quite the same under a stranger's boot. The wind settles different in the trees when someone unfamiliar comes through. I didn't fully believe that until I came back here for good 6 years ago after my mother passed and left me the deed. 42 acres of Alabama clay, some forested, some cleared, all tucked behind the last stretch of county road before the subdivisions begin. My grandfather built the dam himself in 1961. Said the pond would help with drought and hold runoff from the hillside. It did both. Still does. I've kept it up, patching where needed, clearing debris, keeping the spillway open. Most folks wouldn't think twice about a little man-made pond like mine, but it was the backbone of this land. Quiet, useful, and stubborn just like my grandfather. I live in the old farmhouse he raised in the 50s, 2 stories, white clapboard siding faded to gray, with a porch wide enough to stretch your whole life out on. My dog, Roscoe, naps there most afternoons, and I do too when the heat allows. My days are simple: coffee before sunrise, repairs when needed, fishing when it's not too hot, and maybe splitting wood for winter, if I'm feeling ambitious. I keep the garden in shape, mostly collards, tomatoes, and okra, more for the ritual than the harvest. The subdivision started creeping in a few years ago. At first, it was just a few tidy brick homes with lawn signs and realtors waving flags on weekends. Nothing that concerned me. But then came the second phase: identical houses packed tighter, garages swallowing front yards, and new street names with fake grandeur: Magnolia Run, Foxglove Bend, Brookstone Trace. Nothing natural about any of it. You could smell the HOA rules in the air: fresh mulch, overpriced siding, and the sour hint of control. Still, I kept to myself. Most of the new neighbors didn't wave. Some stared. A few asked if I worked around here, or which landscaping company I belonged to. I told one lady I owned the whole damn treeline she was standing in front of, and she blinked like I'd spoken Latin. In her mind, black men didn't own land, certainly not land bordering 5-bedroom homes with in-ground sprinklers and mailboxes that match. I learned quick to stay invisible. I didn't need trouble. But a few weeks back, I noticed something strange. Orange surveyor flags fluttering just past the old cedar fence on my north ridge. That line hasn't been touched since my grandfather strung barbed wire there in 1978. I walked up to take a look, 5 flags spaced evenly poking into my side of the boundary. A little plastic marker staked near the pond, too. It had some numbers on it, a date I didn't recognize. I pulled them up. No one asked to be there. No notice in the mail. No knock at my door. I figured it was just a mistake, maybe a lazy contractor marking the wrong spot. But I kept the flags anyway, tucked into the barn beside my tools. I believe in signs, and that felt like one. The next week, the sound of engines came early. Not the soft growl of a neighbor's truck, but the throat rattle of something heavier. A backhoe maybe, or a dozer. I walked up the ridge again, past the garden, past the cedar. What I saw stopped me cold. A swath of trees had been cleared on the other side of the fence line, all the way down toward the marshy edge of the pond. New gravel lay where grass once was, and men in neon vests were spraying lines in bright blue paint across the ground like they were mapping out a parking lot. I waved one down. "This private property," I said, keeping my voice calm. He looked at me like I'd interrupted lunch. "You with the HOA?" he asked. "No," I said slowly. "I own this property. That's my pond. My land." He shrugged. "Talk to the site manager." The site manager wasn't much better. Mid-40s, clipboard, tight smile. Told me they were beginning construction on Phase 3. "All permitted," he said. "Surveyed and approved months ago." I asked to see the permits. He said I'd need to contact the HOA board. "You're building on my land," I said. "Sir, I think you might be mistaken." I wasn't. I've lived on this land nearly all my life. Every slope and bend is etched into my bones. But the way he said "sir," drawn out and dripping with polite condescension, made it clear he didn't believe a word. To him, I was just another old black man living near a community he didn't expect me to be part of. I walked back down to the house that day with something heavy in my chest. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. Like the land itself had shifted under me. Roscoe met me at the porch steps, tail wagging, oblivious. I scratched behind his ears and looked back up at the ridge. The sun was low, bleeding through the pine tops. For a moment, everything looked normal again. Peaceful. But I could feel it. Something was coming. And it wasn't going to be small. The surveyor I hired was named Jeff, a quiet man with sun-creased skin and a slow drawl that made you feel like things would be all right, even if they weren't. He brought old maps, carbon copies, and digital overlays that lit up the truth clear as day. The North Ridge was mine. The pond was mine. And the 5-acre sliver now being bulldozed by strangers? That was mine too. Jeff shook his head, tapping one corner of the plat with a silver pen. Looks like they either cut corners or someone gave them bad info. But no question, Mr. Garrison. They're on your property by a good 30 feet. Maybe more. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt tired. Tired in the way only men who've been ignored too many times understand. I filed a complaint with the county assessor's office. They told me it could take weeks to investigate. I followed up with the zoning board. They were polite, but evasive. This subdivision was approved under a blanket permit, the woman said, as if that explained everything. Then I went to the HOA's office, a converted model home at the end of a freshly paved cul-de-sac called Sycamore Hollow. The air smelled like new paint and chemical grass. The receptionist barely looked up before saying, "You'll need to speak to the board, sir. HOA meetings are the second Tuesday of every month. Residents only." "I am a resident," I said, voice cool. "I live on the land you're building on." She blinked, then gave a tight smile. "You're not part of this HOA." Of course not. Still, I showed up to the next meeting. They held it in the Sycamore Hollow Clubhouse, a sterile building with fake stonework and folding chairs lined up like a church revival. There were pastries on a folding table and folks sipping from travel mugs, chatting about grass height standards and approved mailbox colors. When I stood to speak, the room quieted. "I'm Solomon Garrison," I said. "The property y'all are building Phase 3 on, that land belongs to me. Has for nearly 60 years. I have the title, the plat, the records." A man near the front shifted uncomfortably. His name tag read Brad, HOA president. He had a pink face and salt and pepper hair slicked back like he wanted to sell you insurance or Jesus. "I'm afraid that's a matter for the courts," he said. "Our development was surveyed and permitted by Crawford and Sons. If there's a dispute, I suggest you take it up with them." "I did," I said. "The permit covers land up to my property. Not on it. You're trespassing." A woman near the back whispered something, and a few heads turned. One man scoffed. Another looked at me like I'd just announced I was building a tire fire in my backyard. "I've lived here going on 30 years, I said. "My grandfather built that dam with his own hands. You can't just roll in and pave over people's lives like it doesn't matter." Brad leaned forward, hands clasped. "With all due respect, Mr. Garrison, you might be misremembering. These things are complicated. Boundaries shift. And frankly, if the land wasn't posted or fenced, there's a chance the developers assumed it was fair use." There it was. That soft-spoken condescension. That white-gloved erasure. "The cedar fence's been there since 1978, I said. "And it's still there, or was, until your men tore through it." That shut him up for a beat. "Well," he said finally, "this can be resolved civilly. Maybe there's a deal to be made. A buyout, a settlement. It's undeveloped land. Surely we can reach an agreement." "I'm not selling." I left before they could vote on the motion to ban non-resident interference in meetings. I didn't want to hear it. I already knew how the story went. I'd seen it before, how black land gets chipped away piece by piece until someone else calls it theirs. Back home, I found more orange flags by the waterline. Closer this time. One had a red ribbon tied to it. Bold. Defiant. A message. I pulled every last one and burned them in a rusty barrel beside the shed. The plastic melted slow and ugly, curling like snake skins. That night, I dug through my grandfather's old files. Dusty manila folders filled with water use permits, handwritten notes, and yellowing county maps. Most of it I'd seen before. But one paper caught my eye, a 1962 certification for private dam use and water rights, Valley Creek Basin, signed, stamped, and still valid. A small paragraph near the bottom spelled it out. All redirection of natural runoff into Garrison-owned basins requires written approval by the title holder. They never asked. Never even knocked. And now, that water, runoff from the new subdivision's roads, gutters, and lawns, was flowing straight into my pond, putting pressure on my dam. The engineers should have accounted for that. But it was cheaper to pretend the water would manage itself. Let nature bear the burden. Or, in this case, me. I went back up to the ridge the next morning, Roscoe at my heels. A concrete form was being poured for a sidewalk. A yellow cement mixer hummed like a hornet. And in the distance, foundations were going in, 35 homes planned, each with their own backyard view of the pond. My pond. I watched the men work, none of them looking in my direction. "They don't see you," I muttered. "They don't want to see you." Roscoe barked once, as if in agreement. That night, I couldn't sleep. The walls of my house, my grandfather's house, felt too thin. The hum of the bulldozers rang in my head long after they'd gone quiet. I stood at the dam just after midnight. The moonlight danced on the water like it always had, but something about it felt different now. Like it knew what was coming. The valve was still there, rusted, but functional. A release gate my grandfather had installed for dry summers, when the crops needed water. I hadn't used it in years. But now I stood there, one hand on the wheel, and felt something I hadn't in a long time. Power. Not anger. Not vengeance. Just the simple knowledge that I could turn it, and the world below would have to pay attention. The first heavy rain came 3 days later. Not a storm exactly, but a long, soaking downpour, steady, relentless. By midday, the dirt around the new development was soup. Trenches filled, red clay ran like blood, and the pond swelled higher than I'd seen it in years. I stood under the eave of the barn, watching water slip over the lower bank like it was hunting for a new path. Roscoe sat beside me, tail still, ears tilted forward. They didn't stop working, though. The HOA had a deadline. Contractors came in with boots and tarps, sandbags and pumps. But they never came to talk to me. They didn't ask about the dam. Didn't check its capacity. They just kept building like it was all going to work out. But it wasn't. And I knew it. I spent that evening going over the permits again just to make sure. The 1962 certification had teeth. More importantly, it had conditions. Any rerouting of water flow into the Garrison Basin required formal written consent. It didn't matter that the development had permits. They were supposed to get mine too. And they hadn't. That made everything downstream from the dam a liability. Their liability. Because I'd never signed off. I called the county again, laid out everything. The trespass, the rerouted drainage, the forged assumptions in their site planning. The woman on the other end sounded concerned. She promised to elevate the file. A week passed. Nothing changed. Then, as if to pour salt into the wound, I found a folded letter on my gate from a law office representing the HOA. "Dear Mr. Garrison, this correspondence is to inform you that continued unauthorized presence within the construction site on Lot 137, now designated as a common-use green space, constitutes trespassing under Alabama Code." Lot 137. That was my hill. My fence line. My grandfather's apple tree. They weren't even pretending anymore. I showed the letter to Jeff, the surveyor. He read it slow, then let out a breath through his teeth. "They're playing dirty," he said. "Trying to wear you down, or bait you into reacting. You sure you don't want to sue?" "I could," I said. "But that costs money. And time. And the court's slow." He nodded, scratching his beard. "Then what do you want to do?" I didn't answer. Not then. That night, I walked the perimeter of the pond with a flashlight. The water was high, too high. The overflow pipe gurgled like a clogged throat. I cleared some debris, then stepped onto the old wooden platform where the valve sat bolted into the concrete. A metal crank wheel with rusted teeth, It hadn't been turned since my father passed. I wrapped my fingers around it. It didn't move. I fetched a wrench and some grease. Took 2 hours, but eventually I felt the first reluctant groan of metal on metal. Then another. By sunrise, the valve could spin freely. I didn't open it. Not yet. The next day, they cut the last tree between my pond and their model homes. It was a tall loblolly pine, probably 80 years old, with deep roots and a crooked crown. I watched from my porch as it came down, falling toward the edge of the dam like it had lost the will to stand. No buffer left now. Just grass. Just water. Just me. Later that afternoon, I walked down to check the site. One of the foremen, a stocky man with a clipboard and a bad sunburn, flagged me down like he had something important to say. "You can't be down here, sir," he said. "This area is restricted." "This is my land," I said. "That dam is mine. That pond, too. You're the ones who are trespassing." He glanced at his clipboard. "I was told this was cleared." "Well, it wasn't. And if you're dumping stormwater runoff into my pond without permission, that's illegal." He gave me a look like he didn't care if it was or not. "Look," he said, "this development is bringing a lot of value to this area. A rising tide lifts all boats, right?" "Only if the tide don't drown you first," I said. He chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. That evening, a second letter came. This time, it wasn't from a lawyer. It was a friendly outreach from the HOA board. "We recognize your concerns and value your presence in our growing community. In the spirit of cooperation, we'd like to offer a buyout of the affected property, fair market value plus a goodwill stipend." A goodwill stipend. As if that was going to erase 60 years. They offered $87,000 for the 5 acres around the pond. I nearly laughed. I wrote my response on the back of the letter in black Sharpie. "No, SG." I nailed it to a post beside the dam. That night, I didn't sleep again. It rained. Again. Not hard, but steady. The pond crept higher. I stood out there at midnight with a lantern in one hand and Roscoe pacing behind me. I spun the valve wheel one full turn just to test it. A low gurgle answered me. Water spilled through the concrete channel, not fast, but enough to notice. I closed it back up. But the noise, the feeling, it stuck with me. There's a kind of justice in water. It doesn't care about HOA bylaws or market value or zoning permits. It follows gravity, follows truth. And when it's held back too long, it doesn't knock when it comes through. It breaks. The next morning, I went down early. The sun was just breaking over the ridge, mist rising from the pond like smoke. 3 new concrete forms had been poured just 10 feet from the dam's edge. One had rebar sticking out like exposed ribs. No permits were posted. No one had spoken to me. No one had stopped. That was when I made my decision. I wasn't going to flood them out of revenge. I was going to remind them what happens when you build without respect. And when you steal from a man who knows how to make water move. I opened the valve at 3:47 a.m. No storm. No thunder. Just me, a flashlight, and Roscoe sitting at the edge of the dock like a sentinel. The metal will turn smooth now, seasoned by oil and time. A low hum followed the release, like a throat clearing after a long silence. Then the water began to move, not all at once, but steadily, relentlessly. I didn't open it wide. Just enough. Just legal. By dawn, the creek bed below the dam had turned into a fast-moving channel. Not a flood, but something close. The kind of flow that strips away the edges of new concrete. The kind that makes a foundation weep. I made coffee and waited. By 7:30, the HOA's contractors had arrived. One of them walked up the hill, his boots squelching in the wet earth, and stared down at the water surging from the drainage outlet. "Something's wrong with your dam," he shouted. "No," I said. "It's working just fine." They called the county first, then the environmental board. Then I assume they're lawyers. But I had paperwork. Permits from 1962. Deeds going back generations. Water rights, runoff rights, land use maps. All of it legal. All of it mine. The water they'd been dumping into my pond without permission was now following the path gravity chose, and it wasn't kind to shoddy concrete forms and poorly compacted dirt. Lot 134's backyard caved in by mid-morning. Lot 136 had standing water up to its foundation slab. By noon, the freshly poured sidewalks near the green space were crumbling, small sinkholes blooming like bruises on the landscape. I stood on my porch and watched. Neighbors came out in bathrobes and rain boots, their phones held high like shields.
A few pointed at me.
One man yelled something. I didn't catch it. Maybe I didn't want to. By the second day, the local news van showed up.
I didn't speak to them.
I didn't have to. The story wrote itself. Private landowners' dam sends wake-up call to HOA. Developer under fire after building on disputed property. HOA fails to secure proper water use agreements. Suddenly, people remembered my name. Not just Solomon Garrison, but Garrison Pond, Garrison Ridge, terms that had been on county records for 60 years, but somehow forgotten the moment they started pouring foundations. The HOA called a special emergency meeting. Brad, the president, reached out to me through a third party. He wanted to negotiate a peaceful settlement. Their insurance company had pulled out. 3 homes were now deemed uninhabitable due to foundational compromise. I told the mediator I'd think about it, but I already knew the answer. A week later, I got a letter from the county. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was close. An internal audit had found that Crawford & Sons, the developer, had misrepresented boundaries. Several permits had been fast-tracked using outdated or incorrect survey data. All development on Phase 3 was to be halted pending a full review. And my property, every inch of it, was affirmed and protected. In writing, with the county seal stamped in gold. Brad resigned. The HOA stopped responding to media requests. The cement trucks vanished. Lot 137, my land, sat empty again. I sat on my porch that evening, Roscoe curled at my feet, and watched the last of the orange survey flags float down the creek, caught in the slow, steady flow of water that was finally running the way it was always meant to. They tried to buy me out again, a few weeks later. A new offer, this time from a private investor group. High 6 figures. I turned it down without reading the rest. The land's not for sale. Not at any price. Some folks said I should have handled it differently. Filed suit. Waited for the courts. Played it safe. But land doesn't wait. And neither do the people trying to take it. My grandfather used to say, if you let a man put 1 foot on your porch without asking, he'll take the whole house before you know it. Well, they put up 35 houses. I opened a valve. Call it revenge if you want. But I didn't break anything. I just stopped holding it back. Now the dam flows regular again, just like it used to. Not all the time, only when it needs to, but enough to remind folks downstream that the water's not theirs to control. I rebuilt the cedar fence, reposted the boundary markers, planted 3 new loblollies by the ridge. Might not see them grow tall in my lifetime, but that's all right. This land wasn't just for me anyway. It was my grandfather's. One day, it'll be someone else's, but they'll know what it cost to keep it. Final line. Let the water run its course, I say. Same with the truth. Eventually, it all finds its way back home.